From an early age, Miles William Giffard showed signs that all was not well. His early life hinted at the kind of inner turmoil that would later take a devastating turn. In the summer of 1948, Miles had a brief brush with a more hopeful future. He played a couple of minor counties championship matches for the Cornwall County Cricket Club. It was a short, sunny moment in an otherwise darkening life. Sadly, even before that, at just 14 years old, his mental health was already causing serious concern for his parents. Many believed that a lot of Miles's troubles could be traced back to his strict and overbearing father, who could possibly have had mental health issues of his own. However, in Miles's case, environmental factors could have played a crucial role. So let's rewind a bit to when young Charles and Elizabeth were just starting their life together in Hampstead, London. It was there on December the 18th, 1925, that their first son Miles arrived, bringing all the joys and sleepless nights that come with a new baby. Fast forward about 4 years and the family grew again with the arrival of Miles's little brother, Robin, a child we hear little to nothing about in this very odd story. Life took a turn for the young family in January 1931 when they decided to pack their bags and move down to the stunning Cornish coast. They'd just had a new home built, a place they christened Carricow, perched right on the cliff top with breathtaking views overlooking St Austell Bay. With 2 young boys to look after, Charles and Elizabeth placed an advert in the local paper, the Western Morning News, searching for a kind and capable nurse to care for Miles and Robin in their brand new cliffside home. Eventually they found someone to fill the role, a nanny, but sadly this appointment turned out to be a source of immense pain for young Miles. Instead of the loving care he needed, he was subjected to cruelty, including beatings and the terrifying punishment of being locked away in a dark cupboard. These experiences must have left him deep, lasting psychological scars that would trouble him throughout his life. From the ages of 6 to 9, Miles attended the Lawn Preparatory School in St Austell, a formative time in a young boy's life. Then in 1939, at the age of 9, he was sent further afield to Skatecliff Preparatory School in Egham, Surrey, marking his first real separation from home. By the time he was 13, he became a boarder at the prestigious Rugby Public School in Warwickshire, a world away from the Cornish coast. It was at Rugby that the difficulties Miles had been silently battling really began to surface. Well, at least that's when we first hear about them. But I've got a feeling they began way before that. He struggled with the basics of personal care, often untidy and unkempt, and it was a trait that would continue into adulthood. Bedwetting was a frequent issue, and in a peculiar manifestation of his distress, he would twist his sheets into tight knots and even bite large holes in them. On top of this, he was a habitual liar, creating further distance between himself, his peers and his teachers. One master at the school went so far as to label him abnormal, while another suggested quite dismissively that he belonged back in nursery school. After just 4 terms, it was clear that rugby wasn't the right environment for him, and he was eventually removed. Concerned and likely at their wits' end, his parents sought professional help and were referred to Dr. Roy Neville Craig, a psychiatrist practicing in Devon. Dr. Craig's assessment painted a bleak picture. He found Miles to be dull and abnormally apathetic, and diagnosed him with a psychopathic personality, noting his apparent inability to respond to either affection or punishment, which in his view made him uncontrollable. Despite this troubling diagnosis, a boarding place was found for Miles at Blundell's School in Tiverton, while he continued his treatment. Unfortunately, his behaviour continued to be a cause of concern there as well. Academically, he progressed slowly, but surprisingly, he found an outlet in sport. He excelled at squash and even earned a spot on the first 11 school cricket team in his final summer term, a glimmer of success in an otherwise challenging period. However, the underlying issues persisted. The lies and night terrors continued to plague him, and he began to experience debilitating panic attacks. Eventually, a more specific and serious diagnosis was reached, a rare form of schizophrenia. In December 1943, Miles left Blundell's School, and in a move that seemed to offer a respite from his troubles, he joined the Royal Navy. His 4 years of national service passed without major incident, a surprisingly stable period in what had otherwise been a very turbulent young life. There didn't seem to be any incidents while there, and it looked as if he had got his life together. Upon leaving the Navy, Miles returned home, a changed young man, possessing a newfound sense of self-confidence. He was no longer willing to submit to the bullying and belittling treatment he had endured from his father. Charles was known in the St Austell legal community for his harsh, aggressive behaviour, not just towards his son, but towards others as well. His temper was often fuelled by alcohol, a battle he had been fighting for some time. He wasn't well liked at all. In 1950, Miles's brother Robin had emigrated to Kenya. Sadly, records later revealed that he passed away there in 1980. Meanwhile, back in Cornwall, Miles's parents, the 53-year-old Charles and 56-year-old Elizabeth Giffard, were pillars of the St Austell community. Charles held prominent positions as the Under-Sheriff of Cornwall and clerk to the local justices, and he was also the senior partner in a well-respected local firm of solicitors. Elizabeth was equally involved, serving as the vice-chairman of the St Austell Conservative Association and president of the Conservative Women's Association. To the outside world, they appeared to be upstanding, involved, and successful individuals. However, behind the closed doors of their impressive home, Carricow, life was far from harmonious. The relationship between father and son was deeply toxic, filled with resentment that seemed to flow freely in both directions. Despite the animosity, Miles found himself working alongside his father in the legal practice. He loathed it. Their days were filled with constant arguments, often punctuated by heavy drinking, with Elizabeth desperately trying to mediate and keep the peace. Miles was also drinking heavily and shamed his father by borrowing money off his friends and stealing small pieces of jewellery from his mother to sell. Then in November 1951, a small inheritance offered Miles a glimmer of hope. He received a £750 legacy, which he seized as an opportunity to escape the oppressive atmosphere of home and move away to Bournemouth, Dorset. But his newfound independence was short. He burned through the money in just 4 months and was forced to take on temporary jobs to survive. First at an estate agency in Hampshire, where he was caught stealing money. To avoid the firm calling the police, Charles Giffard offered to pay back the money his son had stolen, and the matter was dropped. Miles went on to sell ice creams in Bournemouth. By June 1952, with no other options, he had to return to Porthpearn, back to the very situation he had tried to escape. 2 months later, he made another attempt at independence, moving to London and renting a furnished room on Walpole Street in Chelsea. He relied on a meagre monthly allowance of £15 from his father, often borrowing money from friends and frequently bouncing cheques as his financial situation remained precarious. Desperate and running out of options, Miles turned to illegal means to support himself. He went back to his parents' house, broke in and stole some items, hoping to sell them to fund his life in London. It was around this time that he met 19-year-old Gabrielle Valance, a young woman of independent means who lived with her mother in Chelsea. Their relationship blossomed, and after they had been seeing each other for a while, Gabrielle gently pointed out that Miles was starting to look scruffy and unkempt. This prompted a realization in Miles that he desperately needed more clothes, as the few he owned were becoming worn out, and it was part of his illness. Penniless, he hitchhiked back to Cornwall, a long and arduous journey that saw him sleeping wherever he could to find a bit of warmth and dryness overnight. Charles Giffard was far from pleased about Miles's relationship with Gabrielle. He ordered his son to end it immediately, insisting that it was high time he settled down and took up a steady position in their solicitor practice back in Cornwall. But Miles was adamant there was no way he was giving up Gabrielle, and the thought of moving back to Cornwall filled him with absolute dread. He had tasted the excitement of London life and had no intention of relinquishing it. What dark thoughts began to brew in Miles's mind from that day forward? Did he feel utterly trapped, caught between his desire for independence and the suffocating control of his father? On Monday, November the 3rd, 1952, Miles penned a letter to Gabrielle, revealing the depth of his despair. To quote, "I have had a terrible row with the old man, made worse by the fact that, as usual, he is right. Anyway, the upshot is that he has forbidden me to return to London. He says he will cut me off without the proverbial penny. So there does not seem to be any alternative." The letter continued with a chilling line that would later come to condemn him. "Short of doing him in, I see no future in the world at all. He has stopped my allowance. Anyway, is giving me a pint of beer and 20 cigs a day, and has said no pubs." On the fateful day of the murders, Miles found himself alone at Carricow. He spent the afternoon reading about murder and drank about half a bottle of whiskey. He took 4 aspirins, perhaps in a haze of despair and anger, but around 5:30 p.m. he called Gabrielle, telling her that he would be arriving at London that evening. His parents arrived back home at around 7:30 p.m. As Charles Giffard stepped out of Elizabeth's car, which he had been driving that day, Miles was lying in wait. He struck him over the head repeatedly with an iron pipe he had found in the garden. Mrs. Giffard arrived home separately in Charles's Triumph Roadster and went inside. She was completely unaware of the horrific attack that had just taken place. Miles then followed her into the kitchen and, with the same brutal force, repeatedly struck her with the iron pipe. With his parents lying lifeless, Miles made another call to Gabrielle and calmly confirmed that he would indeed be travelling to London that night. He then returned to the garage, where he discovered that his father was still breathing. Without hesitation, Miles struck him several more times with the iron pipe, ensuring his death. In a chilling act, Miles then placed his mother's body in a wheelbarrow and pushed it to the cliff edge. He tipped her over and then pushed her lifeless form over the precipice. He repeated this horrifying process with his father's body. Afterward, he spent some time cleaning up the blood in the kitchen, attempting to erase the evidence of his terrible deed. He then took his mother's jewellery and made his escape in his father's car. The next day, in a cold and calculated move, he sold the jewellery in London for a mere £50. During his overnight drive to London, Miles had callously tossed his blood-stained clothes and the murder weapon into or near the River Otter, further attempting to cover his tracks. When he finally reached Chelsea on Saturday, he parked the roadster outside Gabrielle's home, seemingly trying to resume his life as if nothing had happened. However, the Metropolitan Police, having received an urgent alert from the Cornwall Constabulary, would soon spot the car. Back in Cornwall, the housemaid Barbara Orchard returned to Carricow on Friday evening and was immediately filled with unease. She hadn't seen or heard from Charles, Elizabeth or Miles, and given the tense atmosphere in the house and the known issues with alcohol, her worry escalated. To try and ease her mind, she called several local hospitals to check if there had been any reports of accidents. Finding nothing, she reluctantly went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. In the early hours of Saturday morning, she contacted her fiancé to share her growing concerns. He, in turn, spoke with the Giffard's gardener that morning, and the gardener made the crucial decision to call the police. The police swiftly launched a search of the property and the surrounding area. Tragically, the bodies of Charles and Elizabeth Giffard were eventually located on the rocks below Carricow Point, a grim testament to the violence that had occurred. Suspicion immediately fell upon the missing son, Miles. Detectives correctly surmised that he was likely heading back to Gabrielle in Chelsea, the one person who held such a strong pull over him. That same day, Charles Giffard's car was indeed identified by the Metropolitan Police, who were actively responding to the urgent lookout request from their colleagues in Cornwall. Meanwhile, Miles had spent the afternoon and evening with Gabrielle. Their time together included a visit to the cinema and a few stops at London pubs. Apparently, he had also asked Gabrielle to marry him, but she had told him she wouldn't marry him unless he found employment. Then, in a moment that was both shocking and chilling, Miles seemingly confessed to murdering his parents. Gabrielle understandably dismissed it as drunken ramblings. However, upon their return to Gabrielle's mother's home by taxi, Miles was apprehended by the Metropolitan Flying Squad, who had been lying in wait for him. On Sunday, November the 9th, Detective Superintendent Kenneth Julian, the head of the Cornwall CID, travelled to London to confront Miles. He formally cautioned him and explained that he was making inquiries into the deaths of Charles and Elizabeth Giffard. Miles responded with a chilling coldness. "I know what you're referring to," he stated. "I wish to admit everything to you with as little trouble as possible." He expressed a desire to shield Gabrielle from the investigation. The detectives who interviewed him noted his detached and distant demeanour. Miles went on to say, "I can only say that I have had a brainstorm. I cannot account for my actions. I had drunk about half a bottle of whisky on the Friday afternoon before all this happened. It just seemed to me that nothing mattered as long as I got back to London and my girlfriend. She just fascinated me." He would not see Gabrielle Valance again until she travelled to Cornwall to give her evidence at his trial, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of his actions. The committal hearing took place on December the 12th. One of the most disturbing revelations to emerge from the evidence given by the Cornwall County pathologist, Dr. F.D.M. Hocking, was his conclusion that, while Charles Giffard was already deceased when he was tipped over the cliff edge, Elizabeth Giffard had still been conscious and was only killed by the fall, a truly horrifying detail. The trial of Miles Giffard opened at the Bodmin Assizes on February the 4th, 1953, before Judge Mr. Justice Oliver. The prosecution, led by Mr. Scott Henderson QC, had made the decision to focus solely on the murder of Charles Giffard. John Maud QC represented Miles Giffard, with all his legal fees being generously covered by Charles Giffard's brother, Sir George Giffard. The 4-day trial centred on a fundamental question: was Miles Giffard mad or bad? The defence's strategy was to convince the jury that Miles was criminally insane at the time he committed the crime. Their best possible outcome would be a verdict that led to his detention in a secure hospital, like Broadmoor, with the faint hope of eventual release if he was ever deemed safe to be around society. Psychiatrists were called to testify for both the prosecution and the defence, delving into Miles's long history of mental health issues and the treatments he had received. The very psychiatrist his parents had consulted years earlier testified during the trial, reiterating his diagnosis of schizophrenia and stating that Miles had received treatment for this condition for 2 years, with his parents being warned that his condition could potentially worsen. He claimed at the trial that Miles had been in a state of insanity when he committed the murder, and that he believed Charles Giffard also had psychotic tendencies. Dr. Craig believed this was hereditary. The psychiatrist maintained that Miles had never been mentally stable. His defence lawyer argued passionately that Miles was not in his right mind, repeatedly claiming he was insane and emphasising that he had no prior history of violence and had made little attempt to conceal his actions after the murders. However, the judge showed little sympathy for the insanity plea, and ultimately Miles was found not legally insane. The prosecution skillfully argued that the letter Miles had written to Gabrielle clearly demonstrated his capacity for rational thought and planning. In contrast, the defence contended that the very notion of believing he could kill his parents simply to be with his girlfriend Gabrielle was in itself evidence of insanity. Mr. Maud poignantly remarked he was driving himself right to the gallows. Adding a particularly damning perspective was Dr. Hood, the Giffard family's GP of over 20 years. He vehemently insisted there was nothing wrong with Miles' mental state, portraying him as a selfish and solely focused on his dreams of a sporting career, and that he was only abnormal in the fact that he was idle and just wanted to live off his parents' money. The doctor added that, when asked, that he believed Miles was bad and not mad. Dr. Hood had even previously described Miles as an idle little waster, a harsh assessment from someone who knew the family well. After 4 days, the jury retired with instructions from the judge. After what must have been an agonising deliberation for the jury, they returned after just 35 minutes with a guilty verdict. The death sentence was pronounced, and Miles Giffard was then driven away to Hallfield Prison in Bristol, his fate sealed. In the aftermath of the trial, many felt a deep unease, believing that Miles Giffard's significant mental health struggles had been unjustly pushed aside by the courts in their pursuit of justice. Ultimately, no reprieve came for Miles Giffard. On February the 24th, 1953, he was hanged at Hallfield Prison in Bristol.